Oh, welcome to our last Brown Bag History for 2024. We're going to be talking about music and entertainment in Revelstoke. As we begin, we acknowledge that the land around Revelstoke and on the Columbia River and its tributaries is the Snacks homeland and traditional territory. We acknowledge the ties of the Secwepemc, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, and the Ktunaxa to this land. We acknowledge our use and inhabitation of this land, sacred to these four nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. So this is just a little bit of a lighthearted look at some of the cultural activities that went on in Revelstoke, especially in the early days. We believe that this is the interior of Peterson's Hall because it came from the Peterson family. And Peter Peterson was came to Revelstoke from Denmark in the 1890s and settled on Front Street, and he opened an actual hall there in the 1890s and had entertainments there. There was a little note about when they opened it and how well they had waxed the wood floor that the dancers were sort of sliding all over the floor. That hall was eventually moved to Columbia Park, where Pete Peterson had a ranch, and it's now the home of Ray and Greta Spearbrecker, because Greta was a great niece of Pete Peterson. Apparently he was a bit of a character, but he actually had probably what was the first public hall space in Revelstoke down on Front Street. There were several musicians living in town. There was a man who was referred to as Professor El Paso, who is, I don't know a heck of a lot about him or what his real name might have been, but he was a miner, but he was often called upon to perform at local events. He was a violinist. J. Guy Barber played several instruments and apparently had a lovely voice, so he was often asked to perform at local events and gatherings as well. The Bourne brothers had a general store on Track Street near the CPR station. They opened it in about 1888 and built onto it a couple of times. And the building in the middle here was their main general store. And the second floor of that was a public hall. So they had that available. It's called Bourne's Hall. They had that available for local events. They also had the smaller building. There was actually the Revelstoke Station Post Office when Revelstoke had two post offices from 1891. And this was the station post office. But Bourne's Hall was the location for quite a few events. We actually have a program in our collection of a play that was put on in Bourne's Hall. There was a letter to the editor in Kootenai Star in January of 1893, who called himself an anti-rustler. And he would take part in dances put on by the Quadrille Club. And Quadrille was a kind of, Quadrille is now like what you'd call square dancing, but it was sort of that sort of country dances like you'd see in a Jane Austen adaptation, and you know, sort of partner those sort of planned dances. And so the Quadrille Club would have dances in Bourne's Hall and in Peterson's Hall. They were quite well attended. And this one fellow was complaining that some of the men were monopolizing all of the best girls, and that it was hard for him to find a good dance partner. So he said, most, if not all, of the 20 ladies present were at the very commencement engaged for several dances ahead by the rustlers, who were always in it, leaving those gentlemen who are not blessed with as much brass in their composition to sit out the first hour. After meeting with the usual "I'm engaged" 5 or 6 times, I was glad to put on my hat and go out for a smoke. our Adonises had managed to secure the jolliest partners as usual, right through to the end of the program, without giving a thought to those who are not Adonises and who would have to take their leavings or go home. So it sounds like this guy has a bit of an ego. And then there was a reply to his letter from a fellow calling himself one of them in the next issue of the paper. And he said there was a time perhaps when I would sit quietly and wait till the majority of the ladies had been taken up, and then try to engage partners for the balance of the program, at which stage I was usually greeted with the customary "I'm engaged," of which Auntie Rustler complains. However, having studied the tactics of the habitual rustler, I determined to try his plan. I at once adopted the motto, "Faint heart, ne'er won fair lady." And from that time to this, I find I can get all the dancing I want. It is hardly to be expected that a lady is to forego the pleasant certainty of participating in every dance by filling her program for the indefinite possibility of doing so by awaiting the arrival of gentlemen who are foolish or unfortunate enough to come late. And there was that exchange continued for a couple of more issues of the newspaper before the editor announced that all correspondence regarding the Quadrille Club was closed. So it's just like closing comments on a Facebook post. So that was some of the entertainment that was going on in town. The fellow named Robert Tapping, who was born in England and came to Revelstoke in the late 1880s, and quickly was involved in quite a few things, various businesses. He was doing building, selling lumber. He became sort of the dynamite salesman for the district, but he was also really interested in culture. And he built a building on Victoria Road at Connaught, which is now where the city furniture parking lot would be. And it opened in February 1897 under the name Tapping's Theatre. This is the only photograph I have of it. It's from a newspaper copy, which was in quite bad shape. So unfortunately, we don't have a really good photo of it, but it's kind of an impressive looking building all the same. And it showed the first motion pictures in the North Kootenay by a man named John Cosgrove, who had probably what's referred to as a magic lantern, who was showing what was referred to as motion pictures. They had a concert hall on the second floor, and so it was used quite a bit for local events. And then he also built the Revelstoke Opera House, which you can see in this photograph. So this would be Garden Avenue right here and 2nd Street. And this was that angled street is Government Road, which angled through right from where Lord Co Auto Parts is now. That's the last vestige of Government Road, and it angled all the way through to 3rd Street, bisecting the school property. And so this would be right on the corner near where the playground equipment is. But he built that in April of 1898. It was 50 by 100 feet and complete with all facilities for concerts, operas, plays, and dances. The Revelstoke Herald of October 12th, 1898 said the Revelstoke sawmill finished sawing the joists and rafters for Mr. Tapping's new opera house last week. There were 50 pieces 44 feet long and 100 pieces 36 feet long. The timber was without a flaw and the largest ever sawn at the mills here. So it opened on that December 8th, in early December 1898, as reported in the Herald newspaper of December 7th. New opera house opened by the Harry Lindley Company with the Widow Hunt. The newspaper said on Monday, the Harry Lindley Company opened the new opera house with a piece entitled The Widow Hunt. There was a fairly good attendance. The company shows marked improvement since its last visit, and their specialties are very good. Madame Atlantis is really well worth seeing. The house itself is still slightly in the raw, so to speak, but great improvements are promised by the energetic proprietor, R. Tapping, whose speech on Monday night was one of the features of the evening's entertainment. Tapping was also quite a character as well, quite eccentric, and he's often referred to as sort of being one of the main entertainments of a lot of the events that were held at the Opera House. This was a lot of events were held there. This was the Fire Brigade's Masquerade Ball on December 6, 1911. Um, there was a note from 1901 saying that Richard Copeland, who was a local uh, artist, put the finishing touches on a drop scene for the Opera House. That it is a view of Mount Begbie taken from above the flats at the mouth of the Illecillewaet. And unfortunately, we don't have any photographs that show that background. Um, there was a local amateur dramatic society, and they would have productions on a regular basis, just with local people who were acting in them. This was The Lady of Lyons in 1905, and this was one called Colleen Bawn from 1904, and it was referred to as an old Irish play. So it was performed at the Opera House. Said the scenic effects, the work of T.H. Dunn and his son Percy, were stunning. The acting was compared favorably to professional companies that performed here. And the man in the front there is R.H. Sawyer, who we'll be talking about a little bit more. He was very involved in arts and culture, particularly music. But you can kind of tell what roles people are playing. He looks like he could have been like the village idiot, kind of the way he's wearing his hat there. It looks like the villain of the piece back there. There's the minister and the little old lady knitting. Um, Somebody with a sword there. So it's quite interesting to see that how many people were involved in the local art scene there. The Opera House was sort of went out of use after a while, but there were quite a few performances there. There was a company called the Allen Players that came quite often, and one of their star performers was a woman named Verna Felton, and Verna Felton she was referred to quite a bit, and whenever it came, she was really well liked here. Uh, and apparently she had a fairly deep voice and quite a beautiful singing voice. And she later went on to Hollywood and had a career there. You might know her as the voice in a lot of Disney um, films. She was the voice of the mother elephant in Dumbo, and quite a few others. If you look up Verna Felton, you'll see some of her film credits. So she did some film work as well, but a lot of voice work as well. And she was occasionally mentioned in the newspapers in Revelstoke because people had fond memories of her when she'd come with the Allen Players. They also had the coronation choir from the uh, uh, King Edward's coronation came, and they were doing a tour of North America, and they performed here at the Revelstoke Opera House. So they did have some, interesting performers. The Indigenous poet Pauline Johnson, who's a Mohawk ancestry, she performed here a couple of times as well. Uh, so it was really the center of a lot of things going on in the cultural world here. It kind of fell out of favor by the World War One. It actually became sort of one of the recruiting areas, or they would use it for visiting soldiers who were coming through. They also were using it as a roller rink for roller skating in that period in the early teens. And it was finally torn down in December of 1922. And said Rocco Moyo, one of the contractors who were engaged in dismantling the old Tapping Opera House on 2nd Street West, had the misfortune last Wednesday to be precipitated with a section of gallery, which fell when a square timber 24 feet long was displaced. He was rendered unconscious for about 5 minutes, but was soon on the job again. Robert Tapping was standing within 10 feet of the falling gallery and had a narrow escape. Um, so there was musicians started to form bands in town. In 1892, it was mentioned that in February, it said a select coterie of musical friends gathered at the residence of Mr. H.N. Corsier on Tuesday night, where the principal feature of the evening was, of course, music. There were no less than 6 different kinds of instruments performed on, and the melody produced was excellent. Mr. Barber strummed the banjo with his usual skill. Mr. Corsier played the cornet. Reverend T. Peyton drew sweet sounds from the flute with a master hand. Mrs. Corsier did good work at the organ, and the violin and concertina helped to swell the chorus. And so in September of that year, the CPR band of Kamloops became defunct, and H.N. Corsier brought their instruments to Revelstoke and formed the Revelstoke Orchestral Band. Their first performance was February of 1893. It was still rather, an informal group. And then the Revelstoke Brass Band, which you see pictured here, was formed in 1896 with local merchants subscribing funds for the instruments. Their first public appearance was on New Year's Day, 1897, where they toured the local bars and the hotels. The first bandmaster was Patrick Webb, who was a newcomer to Revelstoke. Some of the other players were H.N. Corsier, R.S. Wilson, Charles Holton, Bert Campbell, and the bandmaster Webb, Robert Gordon, John Patterson, Bert Gaynor, and Eddie Edwards. And they also had Guy Barber, Charlie Wilson, Gilbert Northey, James Edwards, and Frank Vandell on the snare drum. Um, they ordered, and that is again R.H. Sawyer there. He took over as bandmaster in 1899. They ordered these band uniforms with what they called cow's breakfast hats or straw hats, and the uniform jackets were made of cotton duck, but the cotton hadn't been pre-washed and it shrunk. So after a couple of wearings, washings, they were no longer able to wear them. And I don't know if this is sort of after one wash, but you can see a couple of the sleeves there look a little short. So, but there's some recognizable figures in there. There's Guy Barber, and I think that's Mr. Corsier is one of these as well. I think that might be him there. So it's quite a few local people involved in that. Um, so there was one of the notes that I found. There was Bert Campbell, who's mentioned there. He became the editor of one of the local newspapers and wrote quite a description about the band. And he said if band members were required to play, they happily shut down their businesses because their motto was, where business interferes with pleasure, cut out business. By 1901, they were calling themselves the Revelstoke City Band, but when they applied for funding from the city for instruments and uniforms, they were turned down. So they renamed themselves the Revelstoke Independent Band to indicate that they did not receive city funding, but fended for themselves. So that's why they're referred to as the Revelstoke Independent Band. They played at quite a few local events, and they were really appreciative of their bandmaster, R.H. Sawyer. They celebrated him at their 6th anniversary in March 1904, and at their 7th annual Christmas dinner in 1904, he was presented with a gold-cased pocket watch and a watch chain with a locket. And Sawyer's initials were engraved onto both the watch and the locket. And that was donated by Sawyer's great nephew, Don Hawker, a couple of years ago and is now in our collection. So we're really happy to have that. And we have the newspaper article that mentions when they gave it to Mr. Sawyer. So it's quite an important addition to our collection. So R.H. Sawyer was the bandmaster for many years. He came to Revelstoke in 1897 and had a shingle mill and then Riverside Sawmills, which was where the community center is now. And he was the band leader for over 30 years. He was also involved in the dramatic clubs, as you could see from that earlier photograph. Was the choir master of the Methodist and the United Churches, and conducted combined church musical groups in oratorios and cantatas. He served on city council for several years. During World War I, he was in charge of the Revelstoke RMR and supervised the bridge guards. He was a life member of the Revelstoke Hospital Society and was named Revelstoke's Good Citizen in 1947. He died in 1957 at the age of 87. So really an important part of the local musical scene. His brother Harry was also involved in the band. One story that we have from the account by Bert Anderson of when the band was parading one day, and Mr. Corley was the drummer and had the large parade drum that they would use, and they were going to be parading down Douglas Street Hill, and Corley's lived at the top of the hill, and Mrs. Corley was sitting on a chair out on her front lawn as the parade started out. But Mr. Corley tripped over a rock and went head over drum down the hill. So Mrs. Corley quietly picked up her chair and went back inside and closed the door. There's quite a few other little notes I've come across in the paper. 1905, the independent band will give one of their popular open-air concerts from the Mackenzie Avenue bandstand tomorrow evening, and that had the program that they were playing. They were active during the war and afterwards. Whenever there were troops leaving, the parade of the troops was usually preceded by the band, playing them up to the station and playing while they got on the train and left for the Quebec for their training. So they were, big part of the community. This is them marching in the May Day parade in 1925. So we've got quite a few photographs of them being involved in local events. We have photographs of them in the Cusp and in Arrowhead doing performances there as well. They disbanded for a few years between 1927 and 1931. The Canadian Legion asked Dave Orr, local musician as well, to put out a public notice for all interested to meet at the Anglican Hall regarding the reformation of the band. They still had $150 in their bank account from the previous band. So at that time in 1931, formally in 1932, they reformed, and were raising money for a practice hall, which opened on December 8th, 1932 at Boyle and 3rd, so just across from the post office or the parks office. And then, of course, I think there were other times when they were a little less active, but they always managed to reform the band. There they are performing at the CPR station in 1940s. So when they reformed in the 30s, they got proper uniforms, and we have some of those in our collection, the band jackets and hats. Got a few photographs of them. There's some on the steps of the high school in the 1950s, and you can see, they've got proper uniforms at that time. I know we have the names of all of the people, but I don't have them right on me. I know that Gaby Cava is in here, and quite a few other local people were involved in the band at that time. And then again, they were still involved in doing a lot of local events. And of course, there is still a Revelstoke band that's active. The they donated quite a few of their musical instruments to the museum in the early 1990s, some of their older instruments. So we have quite a few in our collection. Doris Morgan had been active in the band, and she was responsible for making sure that a lot of those instruments came to the museum collection. So we have one of the big drums, we've got a tuba, and some of the other instruments as well. And Doris was also, as well as belonging to the community band, she was also in a girls' orchestra with Margaret McMahon and Margaret's sisters, and trying to remember that Mrs. Melnick, Ruth Melnick. She was one of Margaret McMahon's sisters, so they were very involved in music in the community as well. So they had a girls' orchestra, a women's orchestra for years as well. You can see here that this was a YMCA orchestra from 1917 to 1918. I don't have a lot of information about it, but you can see that there's again Mr. Sawyer as the conductor of this band. One of the men in here, and I'm not sure without looking it up, is Frank Porta, a local fellow. And then the Italians had their own band for a while. They called it the G. Verdi Band after Giuseppe Verdi, the Italian composer. And they formed in 1912. A newspaper from August 16th says, the G. Verdi Band gave their first public band concert at the newsstand, corner of Orton Avenue and 2nd Street, and for upwards of 2 hours delighted a very large audience with a fine program of classical and popular selections. The musicians led off with the Revelstoke March, which we don't have any music for, so I'm not sure what that sounded like, but it said it was composed by Professor E. Savita, who himself acts as bandmaster and musical director of the Verdi Band. And the loud applause with which the piece was received showed that the efforts of the composer-director and his musicians had gained the approval of their audience. They did a couple of pieces from Il Trovatore by Giuseppe Verdi and a few other popular songs, including Moonlight Bay. So they were active for quite a few years as well. In 1915, though, they ran into a little bit of a difficulty when a new bandmaster, Antonio Bruni, was suing the Vito Gallicano and others for $440 in salary. But the members of the band claimed that the bandmaster had been absent from his duties and refused to write patriotic music or to teach the band to play the Maple Leaf Forever. So I'm not sure how that one ever resolved itself. But they were active, and we actually have some instruments in the collection that have G. Verdi Band engraved on them. So there's we have some of those people identified as well. That's Dominic Gallicano and Salmo Pratolini in the back, and yeah, we do have some of them identified. This was a little orchestra that formed in the 1920s. They called themselves the Kewpie Orchestra. At that time, these little dolls called Kewpies were popular, and you can see they actually have a Kewpie doll on the front of the drum. And the people in there were Malcolm McFadden with the violin, and Clarence Lyons on the saxophone. Clarence died in a drowning accident in Shuswap Lake in 1923. He was just 20 years old. There's Sam Needham at the trumpet, Jim Sampson on the drums, Chuck Henderson at the piano, and Art Needham on the trombone. And apparently, believe it, somebody said it was somebody named Mickey McMahon who acquired, probably stole this symbol from the Chinese temple, also referred to as the Joss House on Front Street. And it was, we actually have the drum kit for the smaller drums for the QP orchestra in the collection, and we have the symbol, and this is the symbol in our collection, and you can see it has Chinese characters on it, but this is the one that was actually, it's the one in that photograph right there. I'm not sure how long that little orchestra, but they were bands that came and went over the years, still are. This was a little orchestra, and I'm not sure who the musicians were in that one, but they played at a dance, fundraising dance called the Rainbow Dance, held on April 16th, 1947. And it was a fundraiser for a local group that called themselves the Native Sons of Revelstoke. And I think they were probably, maybe a forerunner to the Museum Association. They were concerned with preserving the history of the area. And and then again, for special events, this was not a local pipe band, but a pipe band that came here to perform at the visit of King George and the Sixth and Queen Elizabeth, later Queen Mother, in 1939 on their Canadian royal visit. I wanted to mention Sarah Dickey. She was born in Ontario in 1861, grew up near Brandon, Manitoba. See, her maiden name was Banting. She was actually a double first cousin to Frederick Banting, who the co-discoverer of insulin. They were, two brothers who'd married two sisters, so they were cousins on both sides. She married William Dickey in 1887, and William was already in Revelstoke working on for the railway. He returned to Revelstoke, and Mrs. Dickey followed him in February of 1888. They built a house on this very location in 1899. It was later moved to Rokeby and Third, and is still there now. She was among the local people who got permission to use the former Northwest Mounted Police Barracks at the top of Douglas Street Hill for local church gatherings in 1889. The Methodist, Presbyterian, and Anglican churches all used the barracks until they built their own buildings. And Mrs. Dickey was the organist for most of the church services that were held there. And she also sang in the church choirs and remained involved in the Methodist Church and later the United Church. She died in Revelstoke in 1939 at the age of 78. So they're definitely early pioneer citizens here, and very involved in music. And their daughter, Shella, was a very accomplished musician as well. Here's members of the McCarty family and the Dickeys, with a large bass instrument in around 1915. And so this would be Shella Dickey here, the fourth from the left. Topsy McCarty, Ruby mentions her in her book, because they'd go to movies, silent movies, and Topsy McCarty was usually the pianist for a lot of the silent movies. Said she could really do sort of blood and thunder piano pieces when required. But Shella was, as I say, really a trained musician. There's a note from 1926 saying that the Revelstoke Concert Orchestra is doing a long anticipated musical concert in Mackenzie Avenue United Church under the direction of Miss Shella Dickey. Said she rose to new heights, if that could be possible, after their numerous successes it is already enjoyed. As a conductor, Miss Dickey occupies a unique position in the realm of music. Not only does she claim distinction through being possibly the only woman wielding a baton in the province, but she holds a high place among the whole band of conductors, not only in the province, but in the entire West. Her wide musical training, her fine knowledge of each instrument in her orchestra, as well as a natural inclination toward the very best in music, qualifies her as an outstanding figure in the musical ranks of the province. And it mentions, we have the names of the people who are involved in her in the orchestra as well, and they also had a vocal quartet of 4 local women. So in the late, and she had quite a few pieces, performances that she put on. She was a musical a teacher of piano and voice in Revelstoke, so she would put on performances by her pupils on a regular basis. And there's the Canadian Bureau for the Advancement of Music announces the opening of class instruction in piano on October 10th. And says these days, Ms. Shella Dickey, accredited representative of the Bureau, will be at the schools to meet parents or any others interested in this work. So in the late 1940s, she was the supervisor of the Canadian Bureau for the Advancement of Music out of Vancouver and instructor of the piano classes. She started with 16 schools in 1947 and had 40 schools by 1949. Just have a photograph there of the high school band in the early 1980s under the direction of John Baker. Just a few other photographs I've got here. This is a Chautauqua performance at the Central School, 1919 or 1920. Chautauqua was kind of a movement that started in the US, and they would do musical entertainments and lectures and sermons across the wherever they would travel, and they would usually involve the local school children in putting on plays as well as the entertainments that they did themselves. So this is Ruby Rutherford, later Ruby Nobbs, the little one with the glasses in the front row there. The Ukrainian community at Mount Karshe had a band and choir as well. This was their performance that was put on at the YMCA in the 1940s. This was the adult choir. Willie Chikula is the choir master, and you can see they're all wearing traditional costumes. And he also had a children's band. We do have the names of the people in these photographs. This was Stevie Gayak, later Stevie Dutchman, and I know I do have the rest of the names as well. And at that same performance on March 15th, 1940, it was part of an international folk dance program, and they had five dancers do this traditional Ukrainian dance. And we've got Fred Olinik, John Mamchuk, Steve Olinik, Mike Chalesky, and Willie Chikula. And there was other folk dances held there as well. This is one photograph. I think the woman in the middle is Rowena Meehan. And we've got the newspaper article that talks about the program. It was quite a well-attended event. A lot of local performers in that one. This was a performance in 1938. They're doing a Hawaiian song and hula dance, and young Olive Turnross was the dancer for that. This was a band at the dance at the Sidmouth Hall probably in the 1960s. It's Judy Tillin Vigu at the piano, and we don't. If anybody can identify any of the other musicians, you can let me know afterwards. I think there might be some Markstroms in there. We'll go back to that after, and we can see what we can do. And then, of course, the churches all had choirs as well. I'm not sure which church this one was, but it's a girls' choir circa 1900. And see the girls all have their pretty hats on. It possibly could have been an Easter performance, judging by the amount of flowers there and plants. And this is a United Church Choir in around 1935. And at that time, the church was the building across the street that's now, it was like a hostel. I believe it's housing for resort workers now. And that was the church at that time. And Dorothea Lundell in the back was the choir director. And she directed a lot of church choirs for many years as well. And there's the junior choir in the Revelstoke United Church in the 1950s, and Dorothea Lundell is the the choir director there as well. And here's the St. Peter's Anglican Church Choir around 1920. The minister is Reverend Common Ching, just right in there. And I have no idea why the girls are all wearing mortarboards as hats. That's not sure why that, but only the girls and women. And again, in this photograph, it's combined choirs of the Anglican and Methodist churches in 1912. I already looked at that one. One of the Ian Inkster was a really well-known and respected pipe major. From 1948, it mentioned Pipe Major Ian Inkster won the highest honors at the 62nd Annual Highland Games held in Vancouver on August 7th. He won the special trophy for Highland Airs, the aggregate trophy for open professional piping, and also the grand aggregate, the Randolph Bruce Trophy, which was presented annually to the competitor with the highest points of the day. Among family members watching him perform was his 17-month-old nephew, Roddy Norberg, in full Highland dress. In October of 1948, it mentioned that some of Ian Inkster's trophies were on display in Bu's jewelry store. They included the Vancouver Special Trophy for Old Highland Airs, Manitoba Championship Challenge Cup for highest points in professional piping, another trophy for aggregate and professional piping, and another one for highest points, and the Manitoba Special Trophy for professional Irish jigs. That Ian Inkster is a war veteran and CPR fireman working in Vancouver, where he is pipe major for the Irish Fusiliers. And it mentioned that his father, John Inkster, was also a piper, and we do have information on John Inkster's career as a piper too. So they're certainly well known in those circles. So there's certainly a lot more we could talk about, but we'll leave it there. And I'll wish everybody a Merry Christmas. We'll resume with the Brown Bag history in February of 2025. So we'll see you all back then. And we need to stop there. Oh, here.